Square Rigged by Jack Calvin. Published originally in 1929. Published by the Sitka Sound Science Center, Sitka, Alaska, 2017. Read by Alexander Allison. Chapter 1. A Strange Request. The salt fog drifts through the Golden Gate and brings the scent of the sea. The seabirds call with a strident cry, and their cry is a call to me. By an unknown World War veteran. Must they really go? Must the last of those gallant old square riggers vanish from the seas and lie rusting and rotting their hearts out on the mud flats? Already most of those that had survived the sea had also outlived their usefulness. The banks of the Oakland estuary were lined with the gaunt skeletons of the once stately sailing vessels. And now, if the Nushagak Salmon Company were forced into bankruptcy, the last square riggers in active service would join their sisters on the mud flats. Even the Queen of Asia would have to take her place in that graveyard of ships. The great four-masted bark had just been towed across the bay and now lay at Pier 50 on the San Francisco waterfront, taking in cargo for her yearly voyage to the Bering Sea. What a shame if this were to be her last voyage. But, to Bert Lindsay, the possible bankruptcy of the Nushagak Salmon Company meant more than a sentimental regret at the passing of the sailing ships. His father was the president of the company, and its largest stockholder. Past the corner of Battery Street, where the boy waited for an approaching California Street cable car, streamed homeward-bound office workers from the tall buildings in San Francisco's financial district. Shoulders hunched and heads forward, they scurried their way through the pouring rain and gathering darkness of an April day. Some of them joined the waiting boy and, like him, seemed lost in a study of the raindrops as they spattered on the glistening pavement. By the time the car reached Battery Street, the enclosed section of the middle of the car was jammed with people. The fore and aft outside seats were filled, and despite the rain, nearly 200 men stood on the steps, clinging to the vertical handrails. Several would-be passengers turned away to wait for a less crowded car, but the slender youth in neatly tailored brown overcoat spied a few square inches of vacant space at the extreme forward end of the step. Springing aboard just as the car started, he found a hold high up on the foremost handrail. A tiny stream of water ran over his fingers, across his wrist, and down the warm flesh of his forearm. He shivered. "Sweet patootie," he muttered. "I wish I'd taken Beth's car when she offered it to me. Bursts of sisterly affection like that don't come every day. And I've been home for a week. She'll decide that walking is good exercise. For me." As the car reached Montgomery Street, the grip man released a huge lever and threw his weight backward on another that forced the car's wooden brake shoes down against the wet rails. For an instant, the brake shoes slipped. Then, as the pressure ground the moisture out from under them, they took hold suddenly, and the car jerked to a stop. Half a pint of water surged along the car roof and poured off the edge onto the top of Bert Lindsay's hat. Instinctively, he bent forward. The stream of water continued pouring down his back, while the water that the brim of his hat had caught cascaded into the lap of the man sitting in front of him. "I beg your pardon," he said, struggling to keep back a laugh. Then he looked at the man's face, and all desire to laugh left him. It was a sharp, bloodless face twisted into a snarl. The man swore vividly in a monotonous undertone, which was not so low, however, but that the boy heard him distinctly. Bert felt his anger rising. He opened his mouth to retort, but checked himself. A brawl on a streetcar? Hardly. It was better to ignore the fellow's insolence. And he would remember to tilt his hat backward next time. The car moved forward and began its steep climb at unchanging speed. Bert covertly watched the man in front of him. His dark suit was old and shapeless, and he had no overcoat. He was wet and cold. Every few months his small, bony frame vibrated with a prolonged shiver. No wonder he had seen nothing funny in having a hat brim full of water dumped into his lap. His face fascinated the boy. Eyes unnaturally bright glinted through narrow lids. Thin, colorless lips peeled back from yellow, misshapen teeth in occasional involuntary grimaces. And that unhealthy pallor. A hophead, the boy guessed. It was a pitiful face, and an evil one. 2 blocks up the hill, the man slid from the cable car as it rounded to its abrupt stop beneath the red brick tower of St. Mary's Church and trotted quickly up Grant Avenue into the mysterious world that is San Francisco's Chinatown. Forgetful of the rain and the vacant seat, which was at least sheltered from the drip from the car roof, Bert watched him go. When he turned back, the seat was taken. No matter. He couldn't get much wetter. For the remaining 3 blocks up the hill, the boy was haunted by the image of the sharp-faced man in the dark sodden suit. Only when the car slid on to the crest of Nob Hill did he remember his own errand. He looked about him. Mason Street. The next would be Taylor, and the next Jones. He was surprised that he still remembered the streets. There was the Fairmont Hotel on the right, and on the left, the new Mark Hopkins, just nearing completion. Strange how vividly he remembered it all. Something pulled at his heartstrings. He was glad to be back. Glad. Rain and all. He loved this noisy, hurrying city, and he wondered now that he had been able to stay away so long. And yet he was planning to leave, almost at once. At Jones Street, he stepped from the cable car, dodged an automobile whose bright lights warned him of a puddle of water in the gutter, and turned north. A few steps around the corner on Jones Street, he stopped at the entrance of an apartment house and glanced down the list of names. When he reached Apartment 7, W.G. Hargrave, he pressed the button opposite and waited. In a moment, the latch buzzed, the door swung ajar, and Bert stepped into the vacant lobby. Passing by the automatic elevator, he took the 3 flights of stairs 2 steps at a time and knocked, a little out of breath, at the door of Apartment 7. The door opened silently for a scant 6 inches, and Bert found himself undergoing a close inspection by a pair of narrow, slanting eyes, expressionless eyes, set in the weazened face of an old Chinese. "I'm Bert Lindsay," the boy introduced himself. "Mr. Hargrave is expecting me." Apparently satisfied, the Chinese opened the door and led the way into the living room, walking with short, quick steps that reminded Bert of a hobbled horse trying to run. "Sit down," he commanded, indicating a comfortable chair before the fire. "Mr. Hargrave, he come soon, by and by." Left to himself, Bert sat gazing into the flames, while 100 troubled thoughts flashed back and forth across his mind. His mother and his 2 sisters seemed not to notice that his father was worried and tired. Had his father meant what he said about the possibility of bankruptcy, or was he merely trying to curb the extravagance of his wife and daughters? Why had his father so readily consented to his going north? Perhaps keeping his son at prep school for 4 years had been a heavy drain too. Well, the son would stand on his own feet from now on anyhow. That hophead on the cable car. Why did the image of the shrunken, grimacing face persist in his mind's eye? Would Mr. Hargrave understand that he really wanted a job? A man's job? The boy's sober reflections were cut short by Hargrave's arrival. "I'm glad to see you, Bert," he said, as he shook hands. "This is a better place to talk than my office. That's why I asked you to come here." He lit a cigar and settled himself in a chair opposite Bert, half facing the cheerful fire. He was a fine, squarely built man with black hair gray at the temples. Though the Lindsays and the Hargraves had been friends for years, and though Bert's father was president of the company of which Hargrave was general manager, Bert found that even now, as through his childhood, he felt an instinctive respect for the man that was almost awe. "Now that prep school days are over, I assume you're planning to go to Stanford or the University of California." Hargrave's voice was rich and deep. "Or will you go east to college?" "Why, I don't know. I just don't know what I'm going to do, Mr. Hargrave. That's why I wanted to talk with you. You see, I'm not satisfied to just keep on being a sponge, though I do want to go to college. I'll be 18 next fall, and all I've ever done is go to school and summer camps. I want to do something different before I start college. See a little bit of the world, of life." Hargrave was studying the end of his cigar. "I see. A little adventure, maybe. On your own." "Yes." Bert was groping for a way to make himself clear. "But there's more to it than that. I've seen life from only one side. The side of the fellow who doesn't have to work for a living, or who makes good money by sitting in an office for a few hours a day. Dad wants me to spend next summer in his office learning something about the management of the Nushagak Salmon Company." "Well?" The tone of Hargrave's brief question made Bert uneasy. It was kindly, but there was something else in the tone, too. It wasn't quite contempt. Hargrave's own two sons, a little older than Bert, were already, as he knew, mates on vessels plying out of San Francisco to the Orient. They had started as ordinary seamen. Bert took a deep breath. "Well," he said, "I don't want to start in an office. I want to start with the men who do the work. I came to ask you to get me a job that will take me to the Bering Sea Cannery in the Queen of Asia." Hargrave sat up straight, and his eyes flashed a quick glance at the boy. Then he relaxed again and resumed the study of the ash on the end of his cigar. "That is impossible, for several reasons," he said, and counted the reasons on his fingers. 1. All the cannery men are being sent up by steamer this year. The Queen of Asia will carry only her regular crew and the usual gang of laborers. 2. There is nothing you could do on the bark, and there is no room for passengers. 3. There has been trouble on every sailing ship that we have sent north in the past 3 years. Real trouble that usually involves several sea burials. 4. But the answer to this one rests with you. The seamen who go north with our ships are what the Wild West stories call hard-boiled he-men. Men who have not had the benefit of 4 years in an exclusive preparatory school. Bert flushed. That last was rubbing it in pretty strong. What did Hargrave think he was? A mollycoddle? Well, if 4 strenuous years of swimming, rowing bow in a shell, riding horseback, and playing football made a mollycoddle, then he was it. 5. But Bert was not listening. He was angry, clear through and through, and more determined than ever to carry out his plan. As soon as Hargrave paused for a moment, the boy blurted, "I'm not going on a steamer. And I'm not afraid of trouble, Mr. Hargrave. I'm strong enough to do a man's work, and I want a job as a sailor on the Queen of Asia." Going as a sailor before the mast was a brand new idea that had just flashed into Bert's mind. "I'm going on the bark if I have to sign on as a mess boy, and I'll get the job from the Employment Bureau." Bert rose to go, but Hargrave waved him back to his chair. Had the corners of his mouth twisted upward the least bit? Bert thought so, and his anger cooled. The hard ring that had been in Hargrave's voice when he spoke of Bert's years at school was gone when he spoke again. "I admire your spunk, Bert," he said, "but only members of the Fishermen's Union can be hired as sailors, and it takes a man who's been bred to the sea to work aloft. The superintendent of the Bering Sea Cannery hired all his mess boys 2 weeks ago. I'll get you a job as a tallyman if you want it, and you can go on the steamer Alatak, sailing about May 10th. Bert ignored the reference to the steamer and the offer of a soft job as a tallyman. Nevertheless, he was taken aback by the information that Hargrave had given him. "Why, he hesitated. "I've sailed all kinds of yachts, and I know a lot about square-rigged ships from reading, and couldn't I just join the union?" Hargrave did not answer. He seemed engrossed with his inch-long cigar ash. At last he said, "Is your father willing?" Bert nodded his assent. Hargrave lapsed into silence again. A door opened softly, and the weazened old Chinese shuffled into the room. He looked over Bert's head at Hargrave, seeming not to be aware of the boy's presence. "Can't some flea plate for dinner?" he demanded. "Yes, Tuck, 3 plates. That is, unless you have other plans, Bert." "Thank you, I shall be glad to stay," Bert answered, and his eyes followed the Oriental as he shuffled out of the room on his dragging sandals. Then both were silent again for so long that Bert began to wonder if Hargrave had forgotten him. At last Hargrave spoke. "I may be a fool," he said, "and I may regret it later, but I'll get you into the union if it can be done. The bark sails in 3 days on the 21st, so there's no time to be lost. Come to my office tomorrow at 2, and I'll let you know what luck I have." Bert jumped out of his chair and grasped Hargrave's hand. "Oh, gee, Mr. Hargrave, you're a brick, and I don't mean maybe." Then he flushed at his prep school slang, but Hargrave seemed not to notice. Bert turned as he heard the voice of the Chinese behind him. "Dinner all ready now," he announced, and disappeared. "I may as well tell you," Hargrave went on, "that I have a selfish motive in doing this for you. I cannot discuss that motive with you. I'll let it stand for the time being, as the favor which you seem to think it, and I shall ask a favor of you in return." "Why, of course," Bert began, surprised. "It's just this. said Hargrave. From now on until you get back next fall, use your eyes and ears and try to understand what you see and hear. Will you do that? They stood looking into each other's eyes, the boy and the man. Bert started to speak when the dried-up voice of the yellow man cut in. "Dinner, already, now! You come catch 'em hot. You come by and by, no like 'em cold dinner." He shuffled quickly back to the kitchen. Hargrave laughed. "If you want to know who's the boss around here, ask Fong Tuck," he said. "That old hatchet man rules us with an iron hand." "Isn't it a hatchet man, a sort of private executioner?" Bert inquired. "Is that what Fong Tuck is?" "That's what he was," said Hargrave. "He is retired from the profession now, but I am inclined to think that in his day he was a very efficient assassin." "Then let's obey his orders before he starts polishing his hatchet again," Bert laughed.